So it's important that I've gave the kind of conceptual definition in terms of malleability, but that there is a kind of operational definition of what parametricism is, how we work, the heuristics, negative and positive. Now, when I first started to talk about parametricism, I was focusing on the formal heuristics. But now I'm also find it necessary to talk about the functional heuristics, because the style is not just a matter of form and formal structures and formalisms. As each style has also brings a particular attitude and way of comprehending and handling function and program. Any serious style must take position on these issues, and I think we have a different attitude and position with respect to function than the modernists. So we need functional heuristics and formal heuristics. Starting with the formal heuristics of parametricism, and I think for those who work like this will recognize that they're absolutely adhering to these. I mean, it is not something I'm dogmatically posing. I'm just observing that myself, all my friends, all my students naturally would adhere to these principles without fail. Their hand falls off rather than drawing straight lines. Is anybody here drawing a triangle, a square, or a circle ever again? No. So that's just an observation on that level. So the negative heuristics, that's the easiest one. Rigid forms like complexity, like ability, capacity to interarticulate, of course they are dead. Repetition is the same. Who would go for that? Who would allow that to happen? And can you imagine that contemporary life can be squeezed into such a serial composition? So, like a variety, I mean, it's a definite no. Another one which is interesting, it's much more recent. Postmodernism, deconstructivism was first kind of celebrating collage, interpenetration, layering in an unmediated way. But this kind of notion of pure difference and collage, which in fact is the default condition after the collapse of modernism, reality produces, is at that stage. The real development in this world, the globe over, is invested in just the proliferation of pure difference, of piling in unrelated elements against unrelated elements, etc. But within the discourse, we know that this is taboo. Lack of order, lack of relation. So, classical architecture, the repertoire is out of the question. Modernism, seriality, repetition is out of the question. What goes on in reality the world over, in terms of just piling it in and collaging and celebrating difference, everybody is going with their own shape, form, material, uncoordinated. All of these are out. So where are we going? No. In terms of inspiration and a positive lead, the fascination with nature, and in a sense with respect to the three taboos, the positive formulation would be that we need a complex variegated order. And these are the kind of images we cherish and fascinated with as models for architecture, which must have seemed outrageous and absurd 100 years ago. And Otto is the only true precursor of parametricism during the era of modernism, if you like. So we're trying to create a kind of second nature, complex variegated orders in the different, at the Zahadid architects and the different teaching arenas. And to try to formulate the positive principles which lie behind that, this kind of new phenomenology, new way of working. Soft forms, of course. And that's natural to most of you here. But more than that, soft forms perhaps are able to incorporate a degree of intelligence. They're no longer just forms. They maybe have gravity or structural constraint, material constraints, logics inbuilt, which make them intelligent. Second positive principle, or if you like, dogma, which you always demand of yourselves, and your teachers will always demand of you as students, is instead of repetition, we're talking about differentiation. So we're building differentiated systems with some kind of law of differentiation, with gradients. There might be thresholds, there might be singularities, but there's a law, a rule, the rule-based systems of differentiation. And they can be applied to, meaningfully to, for instance, environmental adaptation of facades. So there's intelligent differentiation of the elements. You can do that by taking data sets like sun exposure and let that drive intelligently, or drive an intelligent then differentiation of Brissolet elements which are scripted off that initial data set. But you also apply that to urbanism. We're talking about urban fields, we're talking about lawful differentiation of a field according to hopefully also intelligent data sets which are relevant. The third category, for me, my kind of most importantly, once you have a series of these differentiated systems, internally differentiated, and only if they are differentiated, we can now think of correlating and establishing correlations between them, where one system drives the other. And these are all co-present systems, which are all there and become representations of each other, if you like. These systems might be, some of them might be, they might be ontologically rather different and radically other. So there will be multiple systems, each differentiated, very, very different, and then you can establish correlations. Here just a simple example of a tower interfacing with a ground and creating a kind of repercussion resonance correlation. Or the way the facade is correlated with the cross horizontal section of a tower, which has then to do with the programmatic from an office area to a kind of residential area. And of course you can try to mechanize these correlations in terms of associative logics and geometry, tie these things together. So what is important here is, for me in particular, that we're moving from single system projects, which are kind of first stage and too abstract to really grip in reality, to the interarticulation of multiple subsystems, so multi-systems, And I'm just showing a few points here. This goes to every project category, but interestingly, we worked a lot on towers, and because the towers are relatively tight type, you distinguish the skeleton or the structural system from the system of internal divisions, from the navigation/circulations of the tower, the envelope. So these are some key subsystems one could kind of look at, isolate initially, set apart, differentiate, and then kind of build up complexity by finding rules which bring on the next layer, settling in and connecting up. I'm just clicking through a number of issues here. The research of bringing out the skeleton in a project. Some of them are projects in the office, and then kind of thinking of the next layer to be kind of rule-based, scripted onto this. Differentiation of the field, and the kind of as the volume shifts and changes, so must the skeleton. So there's the component or genotype, if you like, is internally complex, and as it moves across a kind of volumetric input parameter, the various subsystems adapt. So if you look at the way the current state-of-the-art thinking on high-rise structures, skeletons, is presented, usually you would find that at each kind of up to a certain threshold height, you just need columns, just a framework. A certain height, you need a kind of stiff core as a tube for stability and buckling. To a certain height further, you need to bring outriggers to tie in the outer column line with the column. Above that, you're becoming a kind of tube, a reinforced tube, etc. So here we have current thinking is that for each height, you need there's a phase change to a new structural system, but each of them is treated as a kind of repetitive extrusion up the tower, which is pertinently structural nonsense, if you like, because as you can imagine that there's no way you need this kind of structure up here, and there is pertinent irrationality in these kind of systems of not differentiating, for instance, up the primary axis of the tower where the momentum has this curve. The structural system is blind to this fundamental condition. So you can see some of the irrationality inbuilt in the supposed science of structural engineering, simply because there's a certain framework, a certain a priori categorical sort of approaches which prevent the recognition of this irrationality, because what we're talking about now was simply outside the thinkable of this era. Also has to do with the era of Fordist mass production and the inability to change detail, to change section, to change gradually. Here another version, much more rational perhaps, where at the bottom you have the tube within a tube, then the kind of tube pulls to the inside, becomes a network stiff tube, and in the end becomes a pure frame, and the outside these are just columns. So that is a kind of a rational way of handling these systems through phase changes. There's some of the students' work actually from Vienna, and we're working on, for instance, another way of another system is to use potential of tensile exoskeleton based on this principle of stability and anti-buckling, and replacing that with the tensile membrane and developing skeleton on this basis. Again, using engineering and input, descriptor differentiation, and again, continuously changing skeleton, but it doesn't mean that there shouldn't be thresholds and phase changes in the system. These are just early studies, the first iteration of the DL of the tower skeleton, and different inputs would be just different heights or different volume proportions, and then study of the force distribution, and then of course a creative effort to invent systems which are somehow able to take that differentiation up into their own coherent formal logic, which requires intelligence and becomes a structural logic. But there's nothing one-linerish or mechanical as such about this way of designing. It's only the setting up is the creative act, and then of course the fine calculation is the last step, is the computational process. It's not only about the overall global order of the network of lines, but also the profiles which will keep shifting from condition to condition. The details, the connection details, the tectonics will keep shifting. But the way I've set up this particular research program is by saying I want to break that naturalized coincidence of a circulation core as a cast and placed undifferentiated tube. So that is thrown out, circulation is taken out, and we're thinking about a pure line skeleton without core. And even avoiding floors, which are integral, so the occupiable surfaces, which are usually tied in and locked in as well. So the contemporary tower is not conceptually decomposed, therefore it is so super stable, ultra stable and inflexible, because the core, the floors are tied together. We have different function systems, if you like, circulation, navigation on the one hand, the distribution of occupiable surfaces and space dividers, second, and the structural system locking each other into a kind of freeze position. And I'm unlocking this and talking about skeleton, which are pure line systems, unencumbered, and still totally open with respect to later receiving floors and occupiable surfaces, later receiving, dropping through circulatory elements. So here we're starting again a kind of differentiation of the tower. Perhaps the scripting of a network, recognizing and translating that, correlating that with open and closed surfaces for the facade. No functional logic yet here, just the simple exercise of correlating, of taking one condition you've reached as a kind of input to develop a rule which delivers the next system. The floors coming in, and they react to curvature and facade and by pulling back. So you have a differentiation of that. It's just a kind of chain of, let's say, correlations which build up the complexity of the tower in each time a creative invention of a new rule, and then the kind of working through of the rule. The next rule is placement of the core, equidistant on the outside, projecting in would give kind of automatically a recognition of distance in terms of density of ribs. So there's a kind of local to global inferences. And then we have a rule for bringing ribs in, And we're getting a kind of coherently differentiated, lawfully differentiated, complex artifact, which nearly by default picks up static values and elegance. Then the solid void is looked at again and translated not in solid void, but in degrees of density on a facade network. And then there's an overall sense of orchestrating multiple layers into kind of lawful synthesis where you can local conditions deliver information about position in a global system, etc. So just to summarize that, once more, the principles of parametricism in terms of its heuristics, that means operational definition, how to do it, by avoiding these and by following these without fail. These are fail-safe tools of criticism and self-criticism for project development and project enhancement. So you can always identifying where the rigid forms are still persisting, where there is still too much simple repetition, where there's still elements unrelated, not fully related. You can always ask for further softening, further differentiation, and for further correlation of everything with everything else. There's always more to script and correlate and to intensify the internal consistency and cross-connectedness and resonance within a project, and there's always more work you can do with affiliating and relating it back to contextual situation. It's a kind of never-ending trajectory of project progression. Again, the advantage of this is intensity of relations within, and that is an advantage. I mean, I'm just mentioning one striking example. For instance, communication-intensive social institutions like corporate headquarters with a lot of requirement for everybody to continuously be updated with respect to what everybody else is doing, where you can no longer disappear into a corridor, little cell, beaver away on something, and hoping that what you do is relevant after you've done that for 3 weeks. That's out of the question. So the intensification of relations in architecture reflects the intensification of relations, of communication, of all of us every day with everything, and many, many people updating our own trajectory and relevancy. And that also is with respect which each building can no longer be a silo out on the green field, needs to be connected in an urban texture, needs to be accessible, needs to be connected. And here just a simple principle how you can, with these tools, have striking internal differentiation of conditions and yet have a sense of continuity and lawful variation, even incorporating existing textures. Functional heuristics. I think we also most probably will agree on these. You will commit to them. First of all, I realized there are some taboos in terms of handling functions. We avoid to think in terms of essences. We avoid stereotypes and strict typologies. We also avoid in terms of designating functions in strict and separated and discrete zones. All of these we no longer would do. And I'm just presenting that to you, that you are adhering. These are taboos for all of us and all of you. Positively, that means we're thinking in terms of gradient fields of activity. We're thinking about variable social scenarios calibrated by various event parameters. We're thinking in terms of actor artifact networks. That's the way we break down a program, a task. And that is makes sense. If you think about it, the tools, the formal heuristics and the functional heuristics coalesce, make sense together. To do this, what you want to do, and translate that into form, you need the formal heuristics I discussed earlier. I mean, this point I think is by now clear enough. I mean, parametric systems as techniques, as technologies of design could be used also by modernists like Foster. They could be used by neoclassicists. The point is that the tools by themselves, they have potentials, but we need to drive these potentials and draw the conclusions of what and give values and direction. And that's the difference between a set of techniques and a style, which depends on these techniques, not exclusively, but drives these techniques to a new destiny, if you like. This structure by Foster could only have been done with parametric tools. Every joint is different, every panel is different. The utilization of parametrics made this possible, but the spirit of this application is the spirit of modernism, is the spirit of neutralizing and making inconspicuous these differences. They all are different, but they want to appear the same. Wants to continue this kind of game with a complex shape. And I set against that kind of, if you like, artistic project, but I put that in brackets, of driving and desiring the conspicuous amplification of differences. So that a difference in curvature is driven into radically different conditions of ribbing, of gridding, of networking densely, so with phase changes, and yet coherently shifting between these. They're not collaged. And you can also imagine that a contemporary life process under this one big roof is a kind of modern model of a kind of everybody is the same, doing the same thing. And this one you can imagine being much more prone to the development of versatile conditions, different atmospheres you migrate through, and which bleed into each other rather than being discrete zones. So I think this is much more pertinent image and vehicle of contemporary life and communication processes than that big Foster dome. So the emphasis on differentiation, the amplification of deviations rather than the neutralization and compensation. There's also the difference between explorative design research versus problem solving. Problem solving side is the kind of technique side, the engineering side, the parametric side, the Foster side, and here we're talking about teasing out unknown potentials of these techniques, but with a direction set by the parametricist heuristic principles. And we're on the kind of cusp of moving from an avant-garde condition into a mainstream, I hope. And as with respect to avant-garde, we're talking about even build works are hypotheses, manifestos. But I think some of our works go beyond that and are becoming compelling success stories in the real world. So, the Innsbruck project, for instance, Chanel project, some of these projects I will come back to later and explain what they are, how they are high performance projects which deliver a kind of social process and conditions which could not have been achieved and delivered by modernism, postmodernism, deconstructivism. I'm just clicking through some of this material just coming out of the office just to see the kind of the richness of vocabulary and types of structures we're addressing. There's a kind of unity within difference, or difference within unity. And we're moving across various scales, endless forms, phrase, similar to the kind of organic forms cropped up by evolution. But these endless forms are there to organize and articulate life. Should not forget this. There's no self-serving self-sufficiency, only temporarily within a kind of research division of labor. There could be pure formal research, but that makes only sense in a context where there's a desire to apply, to test out, where others learning and observing and bring it into its purposes. So form powers function. That's the new thesis. Spatial organization sustains social organization. Can we demonstrate, control, and predict this? To a certain extent we can, I would argue. So if you look at the history of parametricism, in fact it's the history of the whole evolution of architecture. We have some fundamental thesis here that social order requires spatial order, and that society doesn't exist without an architecture, without a structured built environment. And as society evolves, it can only evolve if it is able to enhance and further structure and more intricately structure its built environment as well. Architecture provides the long-term social memory as necessary substrate of cultural evolution. So here you can see that a kind of flock of apes, if you like, is able to build up a kind of social structure with the help of a kind of material substrate of evolution, which is this kind of built environment which gives more structure and complexity and gives stability to these evolving structures and complex relationships through architecture in the built environment. And that is moving through various stages. And at each stage there is a certain model which is proliferated across the landscape. It becomes the compelling state-of-the-art type. The medieval city sitting in a kind of landscape, more or less equidistant, equal size, was covering Europe. In the Middle Ages, it's a kind of succeeding model, there's nothing else. At that point, and no city is larger than 3,000 inhabitants, if you like. At a certain moment, all of this would have has been just a kind of unconscious evolutionary process. There's at a certain moment the renaissance, the recognition that one can understand this process, intervene in this process, and establish a kind of plane of invention, theorizing, and conscious projecting forward. The moment of architecture, which starts when the architect separates from the construction, master building team, moves from the site to the plane of the drawing as an arena of speculation, and at the same time needs to, on this plane of speculation, is able to deviate from traditional models, and that requires argument, discussion, theory. And that is a kind of the beginning of architecture 500 years ago. And it shows up in the landscape with a new kind of rigor and confidence. From there it quickly moves up. This is still the amorphous self-organized. This is the imposed and designed. It moves outside of the city and cuts through the landscape to the horizon and builds larger structures. With the Baroque and the mercantilist economy, national economy. And you have these kind of visions and vistas. On the global level and the local level, you have the Baroque can comprehend and give order and coherency and tie together more elements. The Renaissance was just still building additively. The Baroque is using curvature, convex, concave, asymmetries in the parts to tie together larger structures into a unified whole. So there's a lot of observed that the detail of Baroque, the curvature, the asymmetry in its part allows the overall to gain coherence, and a Renaissance architectural repertoire applied to such ambitious complexes would be impossible. The composition would just fall apart into pieces. The Baroque can cope with that, and you can see here the kind of asymmetry of the part empowers the perception and orientation in terms of the overall, just like the amorphousness and unlikeliness of an amorphous element is a precondition. The asymmetry becomes the condition of the power of the then symmetrical composition. And we've kind of worked with that aspect, and you can still then allow partial asymmetries to exist, and you still tie together a very, very powerful image. Modernism, just a few more points. The era of mass reproduction breaks with symmetry, breaks with proportion, breaks with proportional systems, and allows elements to just stretch out into infinity, and allows compositions which are asymmetric, diverse, but there is very, very sharp and set of principles which are, let's say, the dogmas of modernism. You can analyze any modern composition, it will always show the following principles. It will specialize and separate out parts which are internally repetitive with the minimizing of connection. That's the overall order. Bauhaus, and the rationality of this is also clear. You will separate out the apartment block from the administrative block, from the workshop, minimize connections. You have the liberty of disposing each with its own floor-to-floor height, depth, and fenestration pattern. And this principles of separating, specializing, and internal repetition is universally applied. That's also the ordering principle of the functionalist city. Each zone could be radically different and other, but separated out and internally repeated. This goes through all the sub-styles of modernism. So as we move from the white modern to the brutalist, we move from the brutalist to high-tech, we move to metabolism, even including archigram. These principles I was just discussing are always 100% adhered to. The allowing for each individual functional component to be solved on its own terms, separately, developing its own physiognomy, separately, but always internally repeated, and always remain separate and attached minimally. Now, these principles of zoning and separating and optimizing and repetition, at a certain stage during the development of the 60s, 70s, moves into crisis. You have this kind of dystopian projections of this. These are ironic extrapolations by Superstudio of precisely these principles. And you have radical deviations. Sudden, you have these interpenetrations, these disorientations, fragmentations, a radical new principle superimposing instead of having one next to each other. In the difference, we now have one on top and through the other, coinciding in the same territory of these differences. And that was a monumental move and shift and discovery. And since then, we have these kind of multiple systems going into kind of correlative interarticulation. Just showing a few images of these new principles, which are of parametricism in terms of field spaces and interlacing and avoiding of discrete components. These kind of principles we've described in the Rome project for the museum applied to the BMW. I'm just noting this here because this is a kind of high performance production space, which is no longer an experiment, but been selected by a company who wanted what seemed most productive, most effective, most pertinent to their works. And again, I want to focus here that there's this kind of open field space, and we're taking the car park, we're taking the different prosaic matters and materials of this world and bringing them under a strong formalist field logic. Everything here, whether it's the structure, the ribs, the conveyor belts, the lighting elements, the handrails, are brought under the spell of a relentless formalism, and yet this form powers function, I would argue. And there's issues of endless space, endless continuously differentiated space, deep visual penetration, but there's this kind of ordering logic which helps the libidity, the navigability, the avoidance of corner, etc. And these moments of simultaneity and intensification of visual relations within such a space are in these structures. So just to rehearse briefly the historical trajectory from the medieval to the Renaissance to the Baroque. Here's the line where architecture starts and moves through an accelerated kind of steps through these epochal styles, which are also at the same time epochs of socioeconomic development. Modernism, postmodernism, deconstructivism, leading to parametricism. So the attempt here is to think about an alignment of an ordering of the key eras of architecture. So this part in my book doesn't really belong to architecture. The medieval vernacular, the Romantic, tied to feudalism, is just tradition-bound building. There's perhaps a transition in the Gothic. I was always struck, is Gothic part of architecture in the sense I'm defining here? Not quite, because in my definition, architecture is this fully self-conscious, innovative discipline with authors staking claims, projecting forward, backed up by writing, backed up by graphic speculation, compelling with a new medium of perspective. So a lot of these things are missing in the Gothic, or not less fully researched. The Ancien Régime, for instance, in France, paradigmatically. Then we have neoclassicism, historicism as the era of bourgeois capitalism and the nation state. Modernism, tied in with Fordism as a production paradigm, and international socialism, and I would argue the social welfare state, the universal consumption standard. And in this era, in a sense, the Soviet Union was the kind of the development model of that era, and it came to an end. The crisis of modernism is at the same time the crisis of Fordism and international socialism. And in the current condition of global post-Fordist network society, my question is, what is the pertinent response in terms of our collective response in this condition to participate in the kind of the further evolution of world civilization. And I believe that this is a physiognomy which will deliver the next stage of this civilization. And again, in terms of my theory of styles, I'm distinguishing these epochal styles. Traditional styles, always these period of confusion and paradigm shift. We had Art Nouveau Expressionism, for instance, in the shift from historicism to modernism. And we have postmodernism and decon and others in the shift from modernism to parametricism. Within each style, and that some of you might like that aspect, is of course the potential for unlimited amounts of subsidiary styles. There have been, modernism has gone through brutalism, high-tech, etc. There's been evolutions in different sensibilities and different sub-styles, and I expect that same to be possible and happening and evolving within parametricism. So we're talking only the general paradigm, the general direction, which would move through a series of subsidiary styles, if you like. Okay, I think that maybe I leave it at that point and invite discussion. Thank you.
If there are any questions, feel free to use this mic.
Shall we take a vote on this one?
Why do you classify it as a style and not an ideology?
That will be the question of semantics. The concept of ideology would be more prone to the political system. I think within architecture, what I'm trying to formulate, the concept of style has a certain cachet, a certain history, a certain weight, a certain recognition value. That's why I choose to revisit and upgrade that concept, because since the 19th century, I mean, the concept evolved, it became prominent in the 19th century as a concept to reflect on the history of architecture up to then. Then there was a discovery of something like the Renaissance versus the Baroque. That was discovered, as it were, in the 19th century. And once this was kind of posed and the notion of style was launched in this way through art history and architectural history, very soon around the 1830s, the question came up, and what is was also recognition in the 19th century that one was kind of revisiting. There was neoclassicism, there was neo-Gothic coming around, but the question was posed, in which should be, or is there a possibility of a modern style? In which style should we build? That was the explicit question posed. The 1830s, 1840s, the discussion started in Germany, and in the end kind of picked up momentum, picked up dynamic, became more and more urgent, and the discourse of architecture found itself, as it were, confirming in the 1910s and 1920s in particular, that the modern style was coming together, the modern style was kind of forming and happening, and so that pedigree of this concept, where it was a reflective concept about what architecture's history, became a projective concept which found its kind of resolution and fulfillment in the establishment of modernism as the modern style. And you can see that in the writings of Otto Wagner, Muthesius on the basis of Semper. And so I would say I would like to buy in to that and draw for our purposes that powerful concept. And I said also that outside of architecture, it seems this concept means something. And I was thinking of should I let this drift, because there's also a lot of prejudice. Style seems to be confused with fashions, within superficial interests and appearances only. So there were things which speak against utilizing this concept. And one could have said, I'm talking about a new paradigm. But the concept of paradigm is the concept of the sciences. And I'm also insisting that architecture is not a science. Architecture is not art. That demarcation problem is very important. So I thought I will hang on to that and propose back to all of us that we own up and take up that concept of style. Of course, we need to reconstruct it. We need to reconstruct and fill it with new meaning, with new vitality. That's why I'm saying something like styles are design research programs. Also, I think what we have to learn is appearance. It's not only about appearances and aesthetic values, but appearances and aesthetic values matter enormously in architecture. Because as far as I'm concerned, architecture functions through its appearances. We are not cattle or rats who are shoved through channels like only through physical organizational structures. We are solicited into a kind of communication scenario. We are navigating as socialized, orienting, perceiving subjects. So and that we're reacting to atmosphere. We are finding our way through perception, and so that's why I think appearances are very important, and the interest in appearances and subject comprehension is what distinguishes architecture from engineering. So the demarcation issue against engineering is engineers don't reflect on perception, comprehension, on the subjective engagement with something. They just design the physical processes. That's why an engineer can design a power station and an architect doesn't have to touch it. But design is always that. That's why I think that notion of style also transports that aspect. Sorry, it was a bit long.
It's cold, man. Let me say, first of all, I think and I would imagine a lot of people share this, have some kind of appreciation for a sort of colossal arrogance that and then I don't mean it in a cavalier way, and I don't mean it in a rude way, to grab something which is amorphous as hell and to try to insist on a series of categories which in the end rely on language in a way that I don't think you acknowledge. Shakespeare, who is an antique in some ways, made a funny comment about a rose by any other name, which probably suggests experientially that the difference between a label, because you're in love with labeling, and one of the fascinating things about categories in science is that the separation of pieces has made an exchange, which are arbitrary in many ways. And I could go through a series of very interesting experiences in my own life, submitting my dad's poetry to Farrar Straus, who came back with a letter and said, "We don't really know. Is this religion? And is this linguistics? And is this art? We don't know what to do with this. What should we do with this? Do you know Oswald Spengler?
Sure.
Yeah. So this actually has an antecedent. My dad gave me actually that book a long time. Nobody reads it anymore. I think in the 1930s, maybe earlier, maybe at the end of the. But this is the most cerebral guy in a way. But what you take on is a small piece of what he took on, because he took on everything. It's colossal. It's wonderful. But like most of the systems, whether it's Newton, you talked about Newton, there's all kinds of problems with Newton and all kinds of arguments, and they have no electromagnetism in Newton. There are all kinds of problems with Darwin, who can't deal with a catastrophism. There are all kinds of problems with Marx, to say the obvious. So that all of these attempts to account, in a sense, Freud. I left out Freud. This is another one. It's not so much, it seems to me, and what appeals to me about this is not so much that it's so intrinsically, and I went after this, it's so extrinsically, because you insist on it, you label it, you argue for it, and you build it, and that gives it a life. But that gives it a life, and that makes it plausible. That doesn't make it intrinsically so. We made a book a few years ago in anticipation of this. It's a smaller book. It's called Gnostic Architecture. And it was done by Monticelli, and it's antithetical to this. And you didn't mention Nietzsche, actually, who thinks that categorization and consistency and dogma is a place to hide. Because in fact, logic and rationality and method and system are ways of avoiding what is essentially antithetical to that. Not so much irrational, but irrational. And I think there's a very different, I have one other, this is not so much an argument, it's just yakking a little bit. But one thing which has been interesting, Zaha hasn't been around here so much, and I haven't seen her much, but there was a time when we used to talk more so. And it seems to me that one of the appeals of the work, the early work, was how rare it was, and how different it was, and how personal it was. And it seems to me you've added something to it by homogenizing it. You've depersonalized it. And more and more sometimes means the opposite. You know, there's not enough, and then sometimes there's too much. And as if, I don't know what would be a good example. It's not a precise example, but if there were 100 Sagrada Familias, you know, so that makes what it is, in a way, something very different. It's an argument, I think, for architecture as Starbucks, in a way. And I think this is the implication. And in for instance, arguing for differentiation. I don't know actually why, in a conceptual way, the outside would have to reflect the inside anyway. So that your argument seems to be a plausible social differentiation operationally or in content should ipso facto be reflected in an analogous differentiation externally. But this, in a way, is no different from the modern argument that said you can do all these very different things in something which is conceptually generic. We had a discussion the other day about the Louvre, actually, which was once somebody's house and became a museum. So I did a lot of stuff. I mean, we would have to go back and forth for many hours. I think it's and in the end, it's a very powerful argument, and it's a critical argument, and it's an important argument. And I think for people who are either fascinated by it and the effort to do it and to make it and to work on it, if nothing else, is laudatory. You love it, you care about it. I didn't see love in any list, but love has something to do with it because nobody is driven to work in that way, or rarely so. So this I would applaud. The content of the thing, I think, is very difficult to get at in a forum like this because you're saying what you're saying and there's not. But anyway, I think it's very important that you did it and you gave it, and I appreciate it. I think you have a lot of problems with what you're arguing, and there's not a voice of doubt given the history of systems that are clearly flawed in the end. Newton missed it, didn't know, couldn't have known. Darwin had an inkling when he sailed by the cliffs of Chile, and he saw forces in nature that didn't look like they were done centimeter by centimeter, but catastrophically. There's not so much inkling in you that there might be something left out.
If I come back on a few points, I mean, thanks for the...
Yeah, thanks very much. I think it was a terrific lecture, very unusual.
Okay. I just want to pick up a few of your points. The first thing to note is that, yes, of course, no system is perfect. There will be another crisis of parametricism, which I don't know when and how. The conditions would be either shifts in the societal environment, which demand further evolution, or kind of internal exhaustion to a certain extent of the paradigm, but that would be more of an internal further trajectory. That's for sure, but that to say that systems and methodical system building is in itself a problem because there were a series of systems building upon each other. That makes no sense. So Newton was replaced by Einstein, and Einstein could only exist because Newton had prepared the ground. And the same is that, yes, parametricism is all building on modernism. This society is building, it's changing and mutating, and it's building on the material achievements also of the Fordist reproduction paradigm.
Do you think the world gets better?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I can give
when
you an
you look
example.
around, if you look at the history of the 20th century and you look at the prospects for the 21st, and there's an interesting guy, in that context, I was trying to remember his name. He has some substantial reputation as a historian, but as a political historian. He died very recently, who made now a very popular argument that, in fact, the 21st century re-argues the 19th century and the 20th century didn't count, which ought to interest you because your argument is looking at what is argued conventionally, novelly, meaning differently. But differently doesn't mean that it gets better. That's a rule.
I think
you could argue it doesn't get better. It gets different. Some of it is better, some of it is worse, and it's very difficult to say without saying, what do you mean by better? And if you can't...
I think for me, if there's a meta category, which I didn't come to, which I think the fundamental base category in a meta discourse, which would be productivity. In this sense, I agree with Marx. So, but productivity not only measured in output per time unit, but output per time unit considering working conditions, and now we also have to considering sustainability and the burden which brings. But if we put this together, productivity is the alpha and omega of everything, of life, of freedom, of security, of charity, and that's where what is the base category? I measure everything with respect to productivity in the sense of a productivity / vitality of a civilization which makes itself free. And the example to say, for instance, that the systems of modernism were a mistake only because they went into crisis to let something else grow on top and beyond it is really unreasonable. You just have to take the slice of time far enough apart. And I'm sometimes saying, if modernism was a mistake, I mean, I've grown up in the 1960s in a nation of 60 million in Germany, where every single individual, without exception, had a higher level of standard of living, material plenty and freedom than Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. And that is easy done. Every single one had a warm house, running water, healthcare medication, telephone, switching on the TV, discussing, taking the flight to a holiday destination, and that was universally available.
But you're making a whole series. There are different kinds of freedom too. There are freedom from certain problems, but you're confusing freedom to do certain things
as well,
and why you might or might not. So you could imagine a culture or a society that would solve all of the things you talked about. Fidel claimed to do that. Chairman Mao claimed to do that. Joseph the S claimed to do that. And these are culture, and in many ways they succeeded. What Castro did was probably better than what Batista did. But there still remains, if you're free from, and the Soviet Union that you mentioned, there were two interesting guys. One was called Yuri Daniel, Daniel and Sinyavsky, who were writers who smuggled material out, who wrote about this freedom from and freedom to turn on the TV and watch another or something. So some of this might have to do with human intentions and human purpose. You disparage, for instance, some guy who would sit off in the corner of the garage for 3 weeks and not talk to anybody, as if this is either preposterous or pejorative. Guy might be writing poetry. That's the way he writes it. And at some point, that might find an application in the kind of life form that later on you would cheer for. So I think you have to be careful what you leave out when you systematize the corporate world. You described it for us, and what they want, and what they're looking for, and what constitutes productivity. Because keeping your hands going or your fingers going isn't necessarily very productive. This is one of Marx's issues.
Well, what I'm looking at in terms of, for instance, corporate organization and what they require, I mean, of course, the world is full of contradictions.
Let's talk about some of them.
Dysynchronous development, brutality. Of course, I know all this, but at the same time, we need to look at which social structures, which spaces, which cultural tropes and moral sensibilities produce the next level of this civilization. And what is interesting to me is, yes, you have Silicon Valley, for instance, a certain culture which comes out of the counterculture and the social revolutions of the 60s, 70s. And that's where you have to look at. You have to look at the most advanced, most intelligent, most productive social organizations, their culture, their sensibilities, their way of working, their spaces, and see if you can contribute to them, can kind of lift them further, coalesce them onto the next level. That's what I see the avant-garde of architecture has to be doing. If we can speak to them and create spaces for their next level, then we know that we're on the right track.
This is okay, maybe. I'm just not always sure who's speaking to whom. In other words, are you at the edge and they're joining you, or are they in the middle and you're going into the middle? So the question is, who is obligating whom to do what? In other words, are they evolving and now understanding what you once called the avant-garde, which means now that's the rule as opposed to the exception? Or are you abandoning the exception in order to make a different rule? And that tension between, let's say, between the edge and the center is an interesting question. Who's moving where, I think? And the fact that something becomes more generally plausible and desirable and of interest doesn't mean necessarily, if it's more popular, it's gained value intrinsically. It may gain value extrinsically, and then somebody would have to look at it. And Nietzsche would be an example and say, this is what it means, or this is what it belongs to. I mean, you dismissed a lot of cultures.
I believe that we're living in a world society where certain state-of-the-art solutions will be ripple through and be picked up quickly everywhere. So I think that mobile phones, Google, social network sites, all of this. If there's no
but one at a time. Wait. One at a time. I got the same list. I got the same iPads.
Nobody wants to be excluded from that.
Well, maybe a few people should be at least a little more cautious about the acclaim that all. What do those devices mean? I mean, there are enormous problems with exchanges just between people. A lot of divorces. There are plenty of iPhones. There are plenty of iPads. What you call communication doesn't seem in a very human way. But don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it was better yesterday. I'm interested in all the pieces and what seems to work as I understand what works. But I'm always a little bit apprehensive about advocates and cheerleaders for a particular time. I think there are a lot of liabilities that are also attached to the pieces that are positive. And I think a real analysis of those pieces requires not cheerleading, not I'm on this side and I'm not on that side. I think you have to understand what it gives you, because it gives you something else, and what it takes from you. I mean, I can dig into a file of my grandparents' letters, okay? And I can see, I mean, they didn't write much. You know the argument, you've heard the argument. And the meaning of exchange in writing is very different than I get from one of my kids with a whole series of acronyms, which means something very different. It's not necessarily, and the exchange, emotional exchange, intellectual exchange, content exchange, which might be faster and faster in another way, could be slower and slower, or maybe faster and faster and emptier, or faster and faster and easier, and less valued and less carefully done, because rapidity allows something and it precludes something else. And so a quick exchange of information, which is very, very useful, and there's an argument about that, and everybody in one way or another exploits that. But there are other sides to it, which seems to me are an interesting part of the discussion, unless you just want to laud everything that comes down the line. And I think this is intellectually terribly dangerous. And everything has to fit. And there is nothing in which everything fits. It doesn't work that way. It's misfit, which is as common as fit. This is my experience. I don't find that, and I don't find the need, or even in the argument, or even the recognition that pieces, what you're doing, which I love, is you're taking disparate pieces that don't necessarily form a puzzle with edges, whether the edges do this or whether the edges do this. And you're saying, these are the pieces, this is a puzzle, and how they fit. So this I love. I just wouldn't make the puzzle that way. I think I'm more interested in inventing the pieces as I go. But again, I don't know. I mean, I think it really, the energy of it and the focus of it and the intensity of it, as I said, are worth really fighting over and taking apart, which would have to take place in a different forum. Anyway, I guess, if somebody else wants to talk, please. You ask
I
for a
think there's
response like this.
No.
You can't sit and listen to this for an hour or so and not be moved by it. It's moving, which is an emotive side. You don't deal with the emotive side. So I'm like, zzz. Thank you very much.
After 3 hours in the freezing cold, I know better than to ask a question here, but I do feel a somewhat heavy-hearted obligation to my students to make at least a couple points. And I have to say, first, that I applaud you for an amazing presentation, and Eric has already made the extensive case that, at how well-reasoned it was, and I think as a model for of thinking for the students, it's great. However, at the same time, almost everything you said I found horribly repugnant in the nicest, politest possible way, and found myself wanting to object at every point. Obviously, after 3 hours, that would make quite a big notebook of things to say, but I want to just make two isolated points which hopefully won't necessarily stand, therefore, as the most important points, but these are the ones that, when you boil away all the other stuff, because you did remarkably admit to a lot of the criticisms that Eric made, but they went by in passing. The first is, I'm sort of flabbergasted that you would make such huge historic claims and pin such hopes on what ultimately is a completely tool-based phenomenon given to us by a few software engineers in Silicon Valley, designed to that was originally created to produce dinosaurs for Hollywood, and we're going to base the next epical style. We had classicism and its relationship to the gods, and power. We have the democratization, which you went through in great and deserving detail, of modernism and all of the hopes that were pinned on that. And now we have the dinosaurs and software going to give us the next big style. But I guess the thing that sort of depressed me the most in it is that I find no, and Eric also touched on this, humanity in this. And I've been struggling for some time trying to understand why all of this stuff, which demonstrates such virtuosity, such command, such control, is so alien in the end, that there is no human element in it, despite all of the biological references and metaphors that you're able to deploy in its defense. And I think the answer is that, again, and maybe this goes back to the fact that it all fundamentally comes down to the use of this particular tool, which you did admit does not have to point in the direction that you're suggesting, but could point equally, and I suggest probably more appropriately and accurately, in the direction of a pluralism, a continuing of the modern project of democratization into through an enabling process that would put that power of information in more people's hands to create greater variety. I don't see the need for this urge for coherence and all. But anyway, to go back to the reason there are no people in it is because it's being deployed in sort of in this kind of wet dream of engineering envy, I think. It is still obeying the god of efficiency that the engineer obeys, and ultimately you tried to make a distinction between architects and engineers, but I think that you missed the key point that architecture is involved in expression which goes beyond that efficiency, beyond where the tool ultimately can take you as a product of the will, and again, things that Eric was talking about. And so there is in modernism, in its simpler terms, in those terms that aren't blessed with the sort of eye-glazing complexity that the parametric is able to achieve, which is another point. Of course, all life is parametric. Parametric means at the most basic level nothing more than a relationship of one thing to another, keyed in a rule-based way. All design decision making is done that way to a certain extent. All life, all biology, and everything else. So, I suppose the claim that you could make for this as being the next epical style could be made on that basis, but then that trivializes it to the point where, you know, it doesn't matter. It could be anything. But in any case, you know, ultimately it devolves back to devolves to this kind of engineering-based thing that comes back to the machine, automatism, the automatic design, PCAD, and all that sort of thing. And the human element, the will, which you might say is involved in the scripting, the decision-making there. But I look at the images, and, you know, they are admittedly pretty in many cases. They feel, again, alien. And I have no answer for how to get around that. I mean, I certainly wouldn't argue against the advance of technology and putting the power that represents in the hands of the architects. But I just would hope that there would be something more to it than this kind of alien, eye-glazing complexity, this lack of an interest in meaning. You know, again, maybe these are old-fashioned terms associated with architecture, and now that we're getting into sensation and all that. But ultimately, you know, it just keeps coming back to me. There's no humanity in it. There's no people. And I don't literally mean the stupid argument, there's no people drawn in it or anything like that. And I don't mean the argument equally that there's no flat floors, or when there are flat floors, then it just kind of turns into modernism again. But there's no tension. There's no human element. Everything's figured out. Everything blends so smoothly into the next that repetition and discreteness that you were slamming in modernism kind of feels like something we would want to have, because you can, in the old Greek projective way, at least associate yourself with those things. And you can see a kind of a dialogue among things, whereas in this, the continuity of the forms here, the mind-numbing complexity of the alien perfection of these things. Again, I find an absence of humans.
Okay, I might just take 2 minutes to reprise a few of your points. First of all, this mind-numbing complexity is the complexity, I would argue, of contemporary society and our life processes. Our urban environments build up this complexity, and what these tools allow us to do is to reduce or make digestible this complexity, which is proliferating on all fronts. And the subjects that we evolve and are socialized within are able also to comprehend more complexity if it is articulated. So that's one point. It's very important. The second point I want to make is that in terms of the let's say human element, the social element, I think that precisely with these tools, for the first time, we are able, and maybe that's not been demonstrated, be able to take up more of the patterns of occupation, anticipating scenarios of moving through and understanding and inhabiting these spaces on a number of levels. On a level where it's more about circulation, aggregation, where we behave nearly like kind of autonomous in a kind of traffic and public space like an airport. We start to simulate, and we are saying now nearly as a kind of another dogma a priori that all the models we build, we're working particularly with agents and agent modeling, we should incorporate some kind of representation of parametricized activity scenarios. We use particles to simulate crowd behavior. We use smaller agents to smaller groupings and social diagrams we're working with. On a more evolved level, when we come into 3D modeling of environments and phonologically testing out rendering with reflection, with light, we introduce the observer perspective or observer parameters, ambient parameters. So we're using cameras to understand the space. We're using people on character animation to enliven and speculate, allow us to speculate and build up plausible, credible social scenarios in unusual settings. And I think the unusual, slightly alien feel and look of it, I think that's where I believe in that humanity is not a kind of closed book. It's not a stereotypical closed entity. In this case, I'm anti-humanist in this extent that I don't believe there's a fixed human essence. I believe in the openness of human evolution through a kind of social evolution. So my spirit in this sense is that spirit that we are still yet capable to reinvent ourselves into the future multiple times. That it's a sensibility. But I would definitely say that I'm trying to tie this to observations of reality. So although that seems kind of bombastic what I'm doing, there is compared to some other architectural theorists, a modesty. I'm not somebody who wants to use architecture to change the world in terms of the politics of that world. I'm trying to observe social developments, political developments, democratization processes, corporate restructuring processes. Of course, I'm looking at the advanced levels.
But
where
see,
I
think
contribute.
that what
I'm not
Eric would
imposing.
say, but I think
I'm observing
the
and
point Eric
reacting.
was trying to is you're not doing it very critically. You are occupying a privilege in this course now, or the forum like, oh, and be applauding the stuff like now time and they think toward your and using that position to suggest that the tool could be more widely used in varied. Along with resistive program, you're still using it. It's a little this kind of forum. They're very pretty. I think that less with
to think, especially the student that will be looking the future of how we should be resisting some of, for the sake of everybody being almost frozen to that. I actually, some of you to continue the discussion